Today he will be speaking on both Derry and Jerusalem and efforts to mediate conflicts in those two cities. Professor Shaul Cohen, I first met him my first day in graduate school at the University of Chicago. He had graduated from Clark University in geography, spent some time living in Israel, and then came back to start graduate school. He was the lone Jew in our department. I was the lone Mormon, and that was a source of frustration for the other graduate students who liked to party on the weekend. And they always wanted to include us, but they never quite knew what to do with a Mormon and a Jew who had a Sabbath from Friday night to Saturday night and on Sunday, and who didn't drink. And anyhow, they were always confused about, when are we going to party? And so they didn't know what to do with these two religious guys. But Shaul and I both were Middle East geographers. We then crossed paths again in Israel. Shaul was doing research on the politics of planting in the Jerusalem region. I was doing research on Christian-Muslim relations in Nazareth. Those two dissertations were later published by the University of Chicago Press, and we then ended up getting jobs, me here at BYU and Shaul at the University of Oregon. He has continued his interest in trees and planting. He has a book coming out next spring, the University of California Press, entitled Planting Nature, Trees, and the Manipulation of Environmental Stewardship in America, which is an interesting topic about the politics of planting and trees and nature in the United States. We're honored to have Professor Cohen here with us to lecture, and then there'll be time at the end for questions. And then again, there's a lecture this afternoon if you're interested at 4 p.m. in the Kennedy Center. So I'll now turn the time over to Professor Cohen.
Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to be here. I think Professor Emmett is right. We were considered something of a plague at the University of Chicago. They were eager to see us go off and do our field work back in the Middle East where religion and fanaticism belong, as opposed to Hyde Park in Chicago. We did cross paths a number of times while we were doing field work over there, and every time that I met up with Chad, he would begin by saying, Israel looks an awful lot like Utah. And being Israeli, I would say to him, maybe Utah looks an awful lot like Israel. And he said, well, you'll have to come see for yourself. And we drove by the Jordan River Temple yesterday, and I have to tell you, I'm not yet convinced. But I do believe in comparison, and I believe in imagination, and perhaps I'll be convinced as I'm here that there is some similarity in the landscapes of the two places. And I think that type of association, that type of thinking about likes, about similarities and dissimilarities can be useful in situations that we don't initially anticipate. And I'll tell you how I got onto what I'm going to be talking about today. Some years back, I was asked to come and give a talk about Jerusalem to the freshman class of a university a little bit further west of here. They take their entire incoming freshman class and devote them to the study of a particular region throughout the whole year. And they were doing the Middle East. So they asked me to come and give their opening talk about Jerusalem. And the subsequent year, they were still on the Middle East, and they asked me to come and talk about Jerusalem again, and I was happy to do so. But about a week before that second lecture, I got a call from the organizer, and he said, last year we were focused on land and politics. This year we're focused on water and politics, so can you make your talk about that? And I hesitated for a moment, and I said, you still want me to talk about Jerusalem? And he said, yes, we want you to talk about Jerusalem, but can you make it relate to water? And I thought, well, that's an interesting challenge. I can do the best I can, but if you know something about the geography of the area, Jerusalem isn't associated with water. It looks kind of like Utah. So I had to come up with something. What would I do to create a synthesis between the city and the desert and their interest in water conflicts and the resolution of water conflicts? And that challenge, I think, has yielded something which I hope will be productive. In thinking about Jerusalem in terms of water, what I came to was that it was a city that both sides, the Israeli side and the Palestinians, seem to feel a need for, much in the way that one might feel a need for water. And I thought, if Jerusalem were water instead of rock and sand and human construct, how would it be different? How would people think about sharing Jerusalem? How would people think about approaching Jerusalem if it were water instead of solid land? And that's what leads me to today's project. The riparian simile is an effort in which I and a partner, David Frank, at the University of Oregon, are trying to develop a model where people can think about sharing land as if they were sharing water. And our main goal in this project is to get those involved in territorial disputes, particularly ethno-territorial disputes, to shift from contesting their rights to thinking about their needs. And we are developing our model in large part based on material that we draw from the Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database, something that's compiled by another colleague of ours, Aaron Wolf, at Oregon State University. And in that database, which contains over 1,500 water treaties, there's evidence that suggests that when contesting parties are trying to divide up water, they often do it in very creative and durable ways. That they start talking about what their rights are to that water, but that they end up talking about what their needs are. And when they make that shift, there's productivity in their negotiations, and that even if those two parties continue to fight about other things, they manage to maintain their water-sharing agreements. So two sides which negotiate a water treaty may go to war about other things, but they'll continue to share the water in accordance with the treaty that they have successfully negotiated. And so we're working with this model to see if we can get people to try to get into that path of moving from rights to needs, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as I go on. Certainly we are not fooling ourselves that this formula will solve all of the intractable problems that there are in the world. The 20th century is an unfortunate litany of ethno-territorial conflicts, and the trail of blood is both long and deep, and many of those conflicts carry over to the current century. Our goal is not to create some sort of magic wand which will allow people to follow a formula and solve all their problems quickly, but rather to get them to think differently, to shift the paradigm a little bit in a way that might create some space for them to resolve their problems in a more productive manner, and really to find accommodations, even if there aren't necessarily solutions. So I'd like to talk about the riparian simile, about thinking about land as if it were water, in relation to two particular cities and the conflicts that they face, and these are pretty tough ones. So the first one that I want to talk about is Derry, Londonderry in Northern Ireland, and it's here on the map, labeled Londonderry in accordance with the nomenclature of the United Kingdom and the sentiments of the Protestant population of Northern Ireland. The town is called Derry, with the London excised by the Catholic or nationalist population of Northern Ireland and by people in the Irish Republic. And this city is the second city in Northern Ireland, second to Belfast. It's located, as you can see, close on the boundary of the Irish Republic. And it's often overlooked in the academic pursuit of answers and questions in the Northern Irish conflict. And I'm not quite sure why that is, because Derry or Londonderry is really the symbolic heart of the conflict, in much the same way that Jerusalem is the symbolic heart of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So I want us to take a look at this city and some of its issues. The modern city of Derry was begun in about the year 1600. Its roots go back at least 1,000 years more. But it was built as a city, part of the plantation movement, to shift by the British of Scot and English settlers to the island of Ireland. And you can see in the picture here, perhaps you can pick it up, there's a wall. There's an old walled city That wall was constructed shortly after the city was founded in 1600, and a cathedral here is St. Columb's Cathedral. And the walled old city and this cathedral play critical roles in the iconography and symbolic importance of the Protestant attachment to Ireland and particularly to Northern Ireland. These are very important historical spaces, very contested spaces between the Irish Catholics and the Irish Protestants. And they maintain that importance as well in the dispersion of the Protestant communities into other countries, Scotland, England, the United States, and elsewhere. So if you were to pick, if you'll pardon the phrase, a ground zero for the contest between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, many people would locate it in Belfast. I would suggest that it's here in this town of Derry or Londonderry, and that's for a particular historical reason. In 1688, when Catholic King James marched on Derry, he was met with resistance. As the story goes, the gates of the city were shut to his forces by 13 apprentice boys inside the walled city, and there was a siege that lasted 105 days before the walled city was relieved by Protestant forces. So that dynamic of Catholic siege and Protestant resistance continues to resonate down through the political conflict over those centuries and very much until today. Indeed, one of the nicknames for Derry is Sea City. And the Protestant resistance to that Catholic assault on the city is seen as an emblem for the Protestant resistance to what they perceive as a Catholic onslaught on the Irish Ireland as a whole today. So what you see in this picture is the central symbolic space for Protestants in their history in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. And this city has a more current political resonance because it was here in Derry on January 30th, 1972, that 13 Catholic protesters in a civil rights movement were killed by British paratroopers at what became the beginning of the troubles in Northern Ireland on a day that's called Bloody Sunday. And that elevated the importance of Derry in the Catholic world to a symbol of modern Catholic resistance to the Protestant onslaught that they feel. The dynamic works from both sides. And in the decades that have followed since Bloody Sunday in 1972, there's been a sifting in the city, and this leads to where we're interested in our riparian analogy and its potential utility. Derry is a learning case for us. Since 1972, the Protestants have moved away from the part of the city that you see in this picture. They've moved to the other side of the city across the bridge, and you can see in the foreground there's a river and a bridge. There's been a separating out of the two populations. The Catholics have remained in the image that you see, what's called the city side, and the Protestants have moved across the river to what's called the water side. And they did this not out of a desire to leave their important symbolic space, but because of tensions between the two communities that made the Protestants feel unsafe on the city side of the river. The government has facilitated by their housing policies in this nearly absolute segregation of the Catholic populations and the Catholic population and the Protestant population. There are Catholics on the water side of the city, but there are very few Protestants, only a few hundred on the city side. So as a result of this violence and the ensuing troubles, we get a segregation of the city nearly completely, so that the area that you see in this image is dominated by Catholic population, something like 99%. Well, we're curious about this. How can it be that an ethnic community, that a religious community, can move away from that space which is so critical to its identity, which is so critical to its symbolic history and its iconography? Well, in truth, they've moved away in terms of where they live, but they haven't moved away in their hearts. And so each year they continue to reassert their claim to that part of the city and its symbolic importance to them through a number of parades which marshal up on the Protestant side of the city, cross the bridge, circle the old city to demonstrate the Protestant attachment to them and their attachment to the Protestant history, and then they march back to the Protestant side of the city. And this is an image of the paraders coming across. They do so in the thousands, some years 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people, many of them residents of Derry but from elsewhere in Northern Ireland, and groups come from Liverpool, groups come from Scotland, groups come from New York to participate in this annual declaration that that territory in the walled old city still belongs to the Protestants. And this parade goes on for hours and hours, and they have banners, as you can see, and there are bands playing patriotic songs, and they are exerting an enormous effort and putting out a lot of energy to show that though they're not there in their residence, they're still connected and the city is still connected to them. Not surprisingly, this is not the favorite day in the year for the Catholic population of Derry. And they resist the parade through all means that are available to them. In the past, that often was through violence, though the violence was frequently between the Catholic population of the city and the police, whether they were Irish or English. And so the marching days, as the marching season as a whole in Northern Ireland, were marked by sectarian violence and tension. And one of the goals of the political process in Northern Ireland has been to reduce the tension and the violence around these parades, which are a flashpoint for the contesting ideologies of the Protestants who want to remain part of the United Kingdom, and for the Catholics who want a modified political status, whether that be as an independent entity or union with the Republic of Ireland. And the violence that has been characteristic of these parades has in fact been diminishing in Derry in recent years. This is the Bogside, the famous neighborhood on the other side of the walled city where the Catholic population has a focal point. And you can see in this image here a sign which says, "You are now entering Free Derry," a famous marker in the civil rights and nationalist struggle of the Catholics in Northern Ireland, and murals on the buildings that note particularly significant episodes or figures in their struggle for independence. The Bogside used to be a source of contestation on parade days as other days of the year, a source of violence, a place where the Bloody Sunday bloodshed took place, and a place where parade days could expect to see considerable resistance. The Catholic population would come up from here into the Old City to meet the Protestant marchers, and things were often pretty messy. And it's not a surprise that the Catholics would be resistant both to the Protestant message but also to the physical manifestation of the parade itself. Here you can see two images of the walls of the Old City. It was upon these walls that the Protestants would march and hurl invective down at the Catholic population and do their best to humiliate them, to subjugate them, and indeed to provoke them. So what does the riparian simile have to do with any of this stuff? How can we think about this conflict in a way that makes sense in the way that people share water? The modification of the parades lends some interesting hints and clues for how territory can be shared in ways that are somewhat distant from an assertion of absolute right and questions of sovereignty. When the Protestants were in control of the city, which was prior to 1972, they could march as they wished, when they wished, where they wished, and it was upon these walls that they demonstrated to the Catholic population who was in charge. And that was the case even though the Catholics were a clear majority in Derry. The political structure of the city had been arranged through gerrymanders, which allowed the Protestants to control the city government, even though they were only 1/3 of the city's population, and less even than that today. But as the parades have become modified, there have been all kinds of restrictions and accommodations which allow the parades to take place in their basic form, which is to say that the Protestant population can come, sing what they want, have their banners, demonstrate the importance of this space to them, assert their identity and the connection of a particular territory to a particular community. But the modifications are interesting ones. In the stretch that you see of the wall on the left panel, for instance, the Protestant paraders are not allowed to play instruments and they're not allowed to sing. It's simply determined that they are too close to Catholic dwellings for them to be able to get away with that. In essence, it's almost a noise nuisance kind of restriction on what they're doing. Elsewhere on the wall, the groups are limited in terms of their size, in terms of the content of their banners. They continue to sing their nationalist songs, but there is a negotiation that takes place each year on the terms of the parade between the Catholic population and the Protestant population with intermediaries that determine the outcome of the parade in terms of its form, its duration, its content. And this interested us in terms of the riparian issue because the territory is being used by both sides at different times in different ways. Each side continues to assert that it is fulfilling its right to that space, but those rights are critically modified by needs. So we see that rather than having the full-on conflict of the parade in its unbridled form, through negotiation, we get to a situation which leads to something of a diminution of both sides' agendas in relation to their assertion of sovereignty and symbolism in the old city. And these days, in the past few years, the parade has been marked by a dramatic decrease in violence between the two sides. The negotiations are yielding a modified parade. The modified parade and the negotiations are yielding somewhat better relations between the two sides. And we would be eager to consider this a success and a case that could teach us interesting things about the fluidity of territory and the shift from rights to needs. But we are cautioned in our optimism by the sense of many people in Northern Ireland that what Derry reflects is not a success but rather a failure. Some of the people who've been involved there for decades in trying to build bridges between the two communities say that, in fact, bridges are what allow the violence to be diminished. That is to say, the Protestants live on one side of the river and the Catholics live on the other. And they suggest that their goal for Derry is not segregation, even if that leads to diminished violence, but integration, that they're not interested in the short-term gain of a little bit less blood spilled at the cost of a permanent cleavage between the two communities. And so what facilitates this fluidity in Derry is something that's less than optimal. It's segregation. And segregation may be one of the answers in some ethno-territorial conflicts, but it's not the preferred option for many people in this one. For some, of course, it is. So we're continuing to work with this question of the fluidity of territory in Derry and to see the way that the Protestants flow in and out of a Catholic-dominated space, the way that they use the territory in ways that they want but ways that are subject to negotiation. And this provides us interesting material to put into our model. A more complicated case, well, let me just say one last image in Derry. They have a statue that they've constructed. This is called Hands Across the Divide. But you'll notice that the hands aren't yet meeting. And we're not believing that we're going to be able to solve the problems for Derry, though they are interested in working with the riparian analogy. This model stands along the bank of the River Foyle. Beyond it, you can see the Protestant part of town. They've got a long way to go. So I talked about a diminishing of the violence and the success of the negotiations. All of that could slide backwards, perhaps too easily. Still a fragile situation. But seemingly somewhat simpler because of that segregation than the case in Jerusalem. What are we going to do for Jerusalem? What are the issues? For Jerusalem, we want to put the riparian transition into play if we can, so that we move from the conflict stance to a negotiation stance, so that we move from people talking about their rights to people talking about their needs. When they're talking about their rights and asserting their sovereignty, they're talking about permanent control. Israel says that Jerusalem is its eternal capital. The Palestinians say that Jerusalem will always be theirs. Those sovereign and eternal claims do not lend themselves to successful negotiation. So with the riparian analogy, we're hoping that we can find something like there is with the marches in Derry, where there will be sequential or seasonal use, where one side will have access to the resource, will in effect control the resource, that is to say the city, for specific needs at specific times, but that will not be permanent. Both sides also claim some measure of exclusive use in particular spaces. This belongs to us. If you're there by suffrage, not by right, because we are the sole holders of the right to this particular space. Both sides claim that in various areas, and this is so contested that they spend a lot of energy denying the history and the discourse of the other side in order to bolster their exclusive claims. It's possible with water for there to be shared use. We're interested in trying to shift the situation to shared use so that these exclusive use claims will be laid aside. In the conflict stance, when sides are talking about their rights and asserting their sovereignty, they have parochial interests in policy, planning, and management. We're here to do what's good with our resources and our power for our side. Through the water treaties, we track a model that suggests that there are multilateral or bilateral interests where all sides can benefit from policy, planning, and management decisions. And finally, in the conflict stance, it's most important to control the space. And it doesn't matter if that control leads to a degradation of the resource. We want to shift the sides from degrading uses to sustainable uses of space, of territory, of resources. And that's critically important in Jerusalem. As you look at this map, the colors are a little bit washed out, but areas that are showing up in this kind of violet here and here and here are Jewish areas, and then those areas, and I won't try to characterize this color, are Palestinian areas. And unlike in Derry, we don't have that clear division with a river that separates things out into sides. In fact, the reality on the ground shows a situation of proximity which is much more extreme than the map would suggest. If you are in Ramot, then you've got Beit Iksa and you've got Bir Nabala on your doorstep. If you're in Shufat, in the community or the refugee camp, then Pisgat Ze'ev is pressing in against you. If you're in Talpiot, you're surrounded, that's a Jewish community, by Jabal Mukaber and Sur Bahr and Sawahra, Palestinian communities. If you're a Palestinian in Beit Safafa, then Gilo is spilling, the Jewish neighborhood, into your backyard. So they are living very closely, very proximate one with another. And the contest for Jerusalem between the Israelis and the Palestinians has led to a very rapid and planned and yet unplanned growth of the city. Jerusalem now has about 650,000 residents, somewhere upwards of 400,000 of them Jews, 200,000 Palestinians, both Muslim, predominantly Muslim, but also Christian, and then some other international members of that community. And the rapid growth of the city has been driven by politics. It's been driven by the desire on both sides to assert their right to be in that city, to bind it to them through a demographic presence. And the pressure on the city that results from this political contest is leading to a degradation of the quality of life and many of the basic infrastructural elements of the city itself. Of Israel's large cities, Jerusalem is the poorest. It has a poor population, it is under-budgeted, and it is facing many of the challenges that cities everywhere face in relation to providing for the needs of its citizens. But its growth is being driven not by the policy and planning needs or designs that would accompany an ordinary urban process, but by the desire by both sides to load the city up with as many of its own as they can in order to strengthen their claim to a sole sovereignty over the city as a whole or for various parts within it. So what do we do with this city that, like Derry, is critical to the symbolic importance, the religious and national identity of both peoples, that is sagging under the weight of this political conflict, and that has a mosaic of communities intertwined in a way that defies easy separation and delineation? Well, we don't try to do it all at once. And that's one of the things that we learned from the riparian negotiations, is that increment is a good way to proceed, that if you can sort out some of the problems, that helps to move the process as a whole from the articulation of rights to the articulation of needs. And the truth is that there are many arrangements in Jerusalem that are evidence of the potential for cooperation already existing. And this image is, of course, the Temple Mount that is the central point of contestation between the two sides, and the Dome of the Rock here, the Al-Aqsa Mosque here, are part of that Temple Mount complex, which since 1967 has been under the daily authority of the Muslim Waqf, which is to say that affairs on top are administered by Muslim authorities. Initially, they were under Jordanian tutelage since 1967, now under Palestinian direction. And then here, the Western Wall Plaza is the central place of worship for the Jewish community. Clearly, there's a juxtaposition here which is problematic when you're trying to assert sovereignty over this entire space for one side or the other. And there's been a critical problem with the way that people have talked about Jerusalem, even when they've been involved in negotiating. And this goes as recently as Bill Clinton's efforts to broker a peace agreement between Prime Minister Barak and Yasser Arafat. He too talked about the rights of each side. And it was over this particular space that much of that negotiation collapsed, leading to this subsequent period of bloodletting and violence. And the reason that it collapsed was that neither side was prepared to recognize sovereignty for their enemy over this space. Each side said, we have a right to control this space. And the negotiators were talking about those contesting rights. And we're convinced that as long as the conversation, as long as the negotiation is driven by this notion of rights, it's bound to fail. This space is simply too important, symbolically, religiously, nationally, to the identity of both sides for it to be yielded to an admitted sovereignty by the other side. And so we see every reason to move from a discussion of rights to a discussion of needs. And that's already de facto what's taking place. The Muslims need to administer the top of this surface where their mosque is, where the Dome of the Rock is, and the Jews need to administer some of the adjacent and subterranean spaces which are central to their facets of worship. This is in place. This is, for the most part, a successful arrangement. And so our desire is to build on this model rather than to revert to the discussion about who is entitled to what in terms of needs. And there are other models that suggest that this can work as well. And those of you who've been there recognize the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I won't go into any great detail on this because Professor Emmett has written about it and knows far more than I do about the intricacies of how this Christian space is shared. But it is a remarkable arrangement where, again, paralleling what's done with water, space is shared for particular needs in particular ways at particular times. And one church may control a space on a particular day of a year, but not during the rest of the year. Or a church may have, and its clergy may have the right to wash a part of the facility or to carry out maintenance on part of the facility, but that assertion doesn't give them sovereign control of that space in the eyes of the other communities. there are all kinds of arrangements that suggest that both time and space can be fluid in ways that yield sharing arrangements that allow the two sides, or in this case the 8 or 9 sides in the Holy Sepulchre, to continue to argue about their rights while they do what they need to do to address their needs. Ultimately, in some respects, our project may be a bit of a cop-out, in that we're not thinking that, at least in the short term, we can solve all of the problems and resolve all of those issues that flow on the left side in relation to the rights of different sides involved in ethno-territorial disputes. But given the history of the past century, and indeed of our human experience, we're convinced that it's time to move on, to elevate other values, to address other and associated concerns that allow us to pursue those discussions of rights in perhaps what you might call a more academic manner, but one that allows people to address their basic human needs, to preserve their dignity, to maintain their identity in ways that are more befitting of the goals and values that we aspire to and assert are part of our human civilization. It's a difficult thing to do. We haven't made much progress, as you can see from reading the newspaper on a daily basis. But one can look at the record of engagement, both between the protagonists and then all those from the outside who seek to help them, and see that the models and formulas of the past have not been successful. We want to do better, and we need to do better. There are different ways of describing space, of circumscribing it, and certainly of sharing it. This is a map built at the edge of the Dheisheh refugee camp near Bethlehem in the West Bank. A map built by Palestinians. It's a map of all of Palestine, or all of Israel. The Palestinians have an aspiration to realizing their national ambitions in all of this space, and some Israelis do as well. But there are some on both sides who recognize that both communities live within this map and that the map needs to be shared. We're hopeful that we can provide some impetus that will help us abandon what I think is a complacency in thinking about solving ethno-territorial conflicts. We're still stuck in 20th century thinking of sovereignty, of exclusivity, of parochialism. The results of that attitude produce a mounting toll of lives lost and suffering. Perhaps through the riparian analogy, we can get past that and break that logjam and move to a world where ethno-territorial conflicts yield creativity, innovation, and compromise, rather than the pain and the misery that marks the world today. So let me stop there, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Yes.
From what I understand of the Jewish religion, they hold their sacred places sort of private. Do you think that they can come to an agreement of sharing some of these sacred places without compromising that belief in their religion?
Well, that's an interesting question. Let me begin by saying that, like any party in any conflict, there are a whole range of perspectives. Some of them are driven by normative religious views, and then there's everybody else. And even within those that are driven by normative religious views, there's a range. The orientation of Judaism towards the land is that it belongs to God. And then we go through biblical history, which is read in Israel as the chronicle of that people. It's what happened. Some people believe it in theological terms, others in atavistic historical terms. But there's a dispute. There's a small community that says God promised the land to us, and it's ours to do with as God's will suggests, and we're not going to share it because that would be an abrogation of the covenant with God. There are others that say there are compelling values within Judaism that necessitate the sharing of that land, even without abrogating the promise. And one of those, and it comes from interesting circles within the religious community, is that saving lives is paramount, that it rises above all else, and therefore territorial compromise is an obligation in order to diminish the bloodshed, and that infringes upon the promise or the covenant made in relation to the geographical map, but that nonetheless it is superior. So I'd say that there's a range of things. Similarly, on the Islamic side, in this case the Palestinian Muslim side, there is in Islam a suggestion that, or a doctrine, that once land has been brought into Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, it has to remain within the Islamic fold, and that if it falls out into Dar al-Harb, the world of war, it's to be reclaimed. So there are some on the Palestinian side that say Muslim land has to be under our control, and there are others who say that would be ideal, but in the real world we need to compromise. Yes. It's a really good question. Let me offer an emendation before I go into my fuller answer, which is that I think you're talking about a certain cadre of nationalists who are extremists. But there are certainly nationalists on both sides who also believe in cooperation. So it's really an effort on the part of that nationalist community which has a cooperative vision or a pluralistic vision to marginalize the extremists who would attack those very places of cooperation. And one of the things that we're seeing in both the Northern Ireland conflict and the Israel-Palestine conflict is the growth, when circumstances are right, of cooperative non-governmental organization contacts. And I think that those are a critical element. Right now, that's very much in eclipse between Israelis and Palestinians. But it's important to remember the atmosphere that was prevalent in the wake of the Oslo Accords and the signing ceremony on the White House lawn in the spring of '93. All of a sudden, it was a lot easier to get along with the other side and to cooperate and partner with the other side. And this is something that I want to talk about a little bit more this afternoon. When things are going well, it's easier to marginalize the people who would undermine it, and their acts are seen as extreme. When things are not going well, then those people who are extreme seem to make more sense in suggesting that the process is fundamentally flawed and their actions are necessary to derail it. And unfortunately, there are an awful lot of Palestinians and an awful lot of Israelis in power who don't really want to see the process go forward. And so they're not unhappy when there are adverse conditions that create the space for extremists to gain momentum. And that suggests, I think, a key role, and I'll say this now because you're all here and you may not all be here later, a key role for the United States and for the Europeans and for the Japanese and other interested participants in the peace process. Life was supposed to get a lot better for the Palestinians after the Oslo Accords, and it didn't. And part of the blame is theirs, part of the blame is Israel's, and part of the blame goes on the United States and the Europeans, the EC, and the Japanese. If we had followed through on the promises that we made to the Palestinians, it would have been a lot harder for extremist groups to gain the credibility and legitimacy that they currently have. This is something that waxes and wanes. I'm not saying that they would have gone away. I'm not saying that they would have lost all their adherents or those who believe in them. But when the peace dividend doesn't show up, when things in fact get worse rather than better, then people are taught a lesson that this peace process is a sham, it's not for their benefit, and anyone who undermines it is doing just work. And it's unfortunate that the United States, and I'll speak about that element because that's where we are, that the United States was quick to pat itself on the back in terms of how it was going to advance Palestinian nationhood, Palestinian statehood, how it was going to develop Palestinian infrastructure. And then they pulled this little thing out of a bag called transparency and said, but unless the Palestinians can account for things a lot better than Enron ever did, we're not going to give them the money because we don't want it going to corruption. Well, we give money all over the world to corrupt regimes and to corrupt corporations, but somehow the Palestinians were held to a separate standard, and when they didn't